Well, first of all, I'd really like to thank you all for coming. In fact, I'm absolutely stunned by the number of people that have come in their lunchtime to this book launch, and I hadn't expected it to be like that at all. I thought we might have a little audience of 9 or 10 people, so thank you very much for coming. I'd also like to just mention that I got into social protection really rather by accident. I was travelling along on a research path that seemed to be fairly well ordained, and it was to do with livelihoods, and it was moving into considering in a strategic way whether agriculture was going to save Africa from the poverty trap in the long term, and what other arguments one could find to look critically at the kind of agriculture first thrust of a lot of the donor discussion about poverty reduction in Africa. And then one day I got an email or a phone call from Phil White, who is sitting right next to me, and he said, "Frank, would you mind if your CV just went into this project that we're putting together on social protection in southern Africa as the livelihoods person on it? It won't be much work," he said. "You just put your CV in." So I said, "Okay, Phil." And then nothing happened, of course, as is usually the case, for about 6 or 8 months. And then suddenly we got the project. And there was this huge new work area that opened up in front of me. And actually I'm extremely grateful to Phil for his original intervention there. And as I say, we've now been working on social protection in southern Africa, but looking much more broadly at social protection in Africa in general now for about 3 years. Now, Phil and I are going to do this little presentation as a double act. I'm going to kick off with 2 or 3 of the initial slides, and then Phil is going to take you through where the content of the book arises in terms of how the Regional Hunger and Vulnerability Programme worked during its last phase, which was for 3 years from 2005 to 2008. And then at the end, I'll come back in with some of the sort of conclusions and findings and things that the book tries to put across that arises from this 3-year research program on social protection, mainly based in southern Africa. Okay, the context of the book. Most of you be very familiar with this. In the early 2000s, there was a rising incidence of food security crises, particularly in southern Africa, but also in Ethiopia and a few other places. In some cases, these crises could be very well put down to very specific causes, such as civil conflict or conflict between states or massive droughts and so on. But in the southern African case, it very quickly became clear that relatively small interruptions in normal patterns of weather were causing really quite disproportionate hardship and hunger in the populations that experienced them. And it's in the context of that, the discussion actually quite quickly began to shift to a feeling that there was a massive problem of chronic extreme vulnerability in southern African countries that had probably been growing for at least the preceding 10 years, such that these relatively small climatic problems turned into very serious humanitarian crises. Now, as we all know, the conventional approach to dealing with humanitarian crises is to wait until they occur and then to start emergency calls for action and the emergency action itself in order to deal with the problems as they grow. And a lot of that emergency action traditionally has been food aid, and it's not only been food aid, it's been food aid from outside the region where the problem is. And there's all the difficulties and costs and delays related to the logistics of bringing food in to the area within a country where the problems are occurring. And in many cases, the result of that whole process is that the food aid actually arrives too late to help some of the people that have got into difficulty as a consequence of the crisis as it has arisen. And particularly important in that context is children for whom 3 or 4 months of serious malnourishment actually becomes a life sentence to a much worse life than they would otherwise have experienced. So in relation to the problem of humanitarian action coming into play in an emergency way in response to crises that were chronic, it clearly became necessary to rethink the way the whole approach to these problems was being conducted. And so policy ideas began to change quite rapidly at that time, and a very clear conclusion arising from events in southern Africa in 2001-2002 was that chronic, predictable proneness to hunger is poorly addressed by emergency responses for the reasons that I've just suggested. And from that arises the possibility, would it not be better to provide vulnerable families with regular support on a monthly basis? Then a great deal of the hunger caused by relatively minor shocks could be avoided. And I'll come in a moment to some figures around that. And the overall slogan that developed around this at the time that the Regional Hunger and Vulnerability Programme was created was predictable funding for predictable needs as a replacement for the unpredictable and high cost of emergency responses. Ethiopia provides an immediate example. Over the past 20 years, or over the 20 years leading up to the period I'm talking about in the early 2000s, around 11 to 12% of Ethiopians were under emergency food security measures of one kind or another. That's 7 to 8 million people every single year were in this situation of requiring support. And every single year the Ethiopian government would wait for an interval, sometimes for an uncomfortably long interval, and then turn to the international community and ask for emergency support to deal with the problem. And it seems to be very obvious in retrospect, but wasn't so obvious at the time, that perhaps this would be better dealt with by saying, hey, we've got these 7 to 8 million people, why aren't we actually supporting them on a continuous basis rather than waiting until it becomes a serious problem and emergency action has to swing into place. Interestingly also in that context is the question of whether supporting people continuously turns out to be less expensive than supporting them utilising emergency action. And in this context, a recent programme which is DFID funded and which is being in process of being put into place in Kenya had some work done in its kind of inception period which suggested that the cost of providing very vulnerable people in northern Kenya with a continuous monthly cash transfer was US dollars 55 per month, as against US dollars 79 per month that it had been costing each year to provide emergency humanitarian support to those people. And there's been a lot of discussion around that, and I don't know to what degree there's other data that supports that, but it seems possible that continuous support can end up by being lower cost to the funders of social protection of different kinds, although I wouldn't actually call emergency response strictly social protection, could turn out to be lower cost than the emergency action. And I will now turn over to Phil to take over on the Regional Hunger and Vulnerability Programme.
Thank you, Frank. Just another word on Ethiopia. Not only is there a question of cost about this, but there's also a question of discretion, that relying on ad hoc emergency food aid, in all cases, but especially in Ethiopia, it was at the discretion of government and at the discretion of donors that food aid was provided. Now, Ethiopia was at the center for a long period, has been, of a number of wars. And the political economy of food aid came very much into the equation when it came to where the government was distributing food aid and the donor attitude to providing food aid to Ethiopia as well. So it's this problem of emergency food aid being a discretionary thing as well that had to be tackled by a new approach. The Regional Hunger and Vulnerability Programme, that Frank mentioned, and I have to reciprocate to say that we're very, very lucky indeed to have had Frank on this programme. He doesn't realise the discussions that went on to try to persuade him to join it. But I think we've got our money's worth out of him several times over. It's a program that's been going on now since 2005. It's just entered the second phase, but this work arises out of the first phase of the program, which ended last September. It's funded by DFID, and it's one of a series of DFID responses to chronic vulnerability in Africa. But this was not implementing anything on the ground. It was policy-oriented program. It had three main components. One was policy influencing, trying to shift, particularly governments, in the direction of committing to on-budget, long-term social protection as a right, rather than ad hoc, discretionary emergency responses to disasters and poverty and vulnerability. But informing that whole policy process was what we called an evidence component. It was called evidence rather than research, simply because of the sensitivities around the word research. Whenever we mentioned research, people, that's too academic, among some of the agencies we were working with. So we said, okay, we'll call it an evidence component. So I became the evidence building manager. And alongside that was a capacity building and vulnerability analysis and assessment component, which looked at how to support vulnerability assessment committees in their information task of informing governments, international community, how serious or not the situation was with respect to food security and vulnerability. The program covered 6 countries during phase 1, Lesotho, Malawi, Mozambique, Swaziland, Zambia and Zimbabwe. These were the 6 countries that were most seriously affected by the food crisis in 2002-2003 and became the subject of a large UN appeal. So it was in the aftermath of that these vulnerability assessment committees were established, but also that there was this impetus towards taking a longer-term approach to vulnerability. We started by doing an inventory of social protection initiatives across the 6 countries. That led to quite extensive consultations on what the knowledge gaps were, where research should be directed. And that led to a thing we called the REBA, the Regional Evidence Building Agenda, which was a series of commissioned studies. Last thing about the commissioning process, the commissioned studies, the implementation of those studies lasted about 18 months. And this looked at a wide variety of social protection initiatives that were starting up at the time as well as a set of themes. Now, this approach was taken because even as RHVP started, there were a lot of initiatives bobbing up all over the region. Some of these, many of them, most of them, were NGO-led, NGO-implemented, donor-funded pilots, which were started in a fairly patchwork, experimental fashion around the region. One or two of them were government national-scale initiatives, which had quite a different character to them. And we realized that we needed not just to look at one or two of these projects, but quite a wide cross-section of them, including the government ones and the NGO ones. So we couldn't do all that ourselves. We had to commission this out. So we commissioned it out to local research institutions. And Frank, Stephen Devereux, and myself took a sort of mentoring role and then a pulling together role, synthesis role at the end. So these were the various programs we looked at across all the 6 of those countries. And they fall into a number of groups: unconditional cash transfers, unconditional food transfers, conditional food transfers, farm input transfers. We looked at these because we weren't just taking a narrow view of social protection as being simply protective or provision of assistance in a welfare context, but also promoted in the sense of trying to promote people's ability to climb out of vulnerability, access to services and other schemes. Now, 15 of those were chosen for the book. And across those projects, we looked at these 7 themes. Vulnerability, the nature of vulnerability, the program's interpretation of vulnerability and how they addressed it, how they targeted their beneficiaries, which is a huge, complex topic in itself, methods of targeting, but also the politics of targeting. Delivery systems, in what form were transfers made, and how were they actually effective, the role of electronic innovations in delivery in those. Coordination and coverage, how agencies coordinated amongst each other, and the spatial and temporal coverage across vulnerable populations. How cost effective, what was the value for money, both in terms of cost efficiency of delivery, but also cost effectiveness of impacts. Their market effects, their effects on markets, but also the effects of markets on scheme effectiveness, and the two, of course, are related. And asset effects, their ability to enable people to protect assets, but also to build assets. And around these themes, we also looked at the whole political and institutional context of social protection, relationships between government, donors, between different bits of government, the political economy of social protection, patronage networks, the role of civil society, and so on. I'll hand back to Frank now.
Right, I think we've got to accelerate because we've had a note from the chair to say we've only got a few minutes left. Thinking back on those themes and the case studies, what the book tries to do is to have a sort of continuous interaction going between the 7 social protection themes and the 15 case studies that we chose to use in the book. And I will leave it up to the reader to see whether that actually works and turns out to be a useful way to have done that. In the process of that, we take quite a critical view. We look at strengths, but we also look at weaknesses that appear in the experience of a whole set of case studies of social protection. Some long-term, some short-term, some with a very wide coverage, some with a narrow coverage, and so on. And all the time that we do that, we do stay very firmly rooted in the practicalities of delivering social protection to the beneficiaries. So if you're looking for a really challenging academic read, this is not the book for you. This is a book that keeps its feet fairly firmly planted on the ground. Arising from the book, we began to sort of detect some pretty sort of common sense, in a way, best practice principles around delivering social protection well to its beneficiaries. And this is a list lifted straight from one of the chapters in the book of such best practice principles, and I'll just run through it extremely quickly. Clearly, to protect people from hunger while not relegating them to victim status. Well, in relation to that, there's always the possibility with food rations, and particularly discretionary food rations, that actually the sort of victim side of things tends to rise to the fore, and for that reason cash transfers are perhaps preferable. To increase options and choice where it's feasible to do so. Again, cash is considered to do that far more than food, because you can opt to do different things with the cash allocation that you've been given. To ensure inclusion of socially marginalised groups, for example, AIDS orphans and the disabled and so on, and minority ethnic groups. To target well and to avoid exclusion or inclusion errors. To ensure cost efficiency in delivery, which Phil has already mentioned. To support rather than undermine local markets. Now that's another one where the food cash balance is an interesting one, because if you bring a lot of food aid into a region, and particularly if you keep doing it year after year, there's a serious problem that you may undermine local food markets in the process, and therefore make agriculture even less robust than it was before. Whereas if you're bringing cash on a regular basis into a locality, you're actually increasing cash in circulation, with the possibility that in addition to improving the situation of agricultural prices, you may also help to generate other economic activities going on at the same time. To ensure continuity in funding and coverage. This actually is one of the really critical points. An awful lot of small-scale social protection that has gone on throughout sub-Saharan Africa over the last 20 years has often been very short-term. It's something where perhaps an NGO or a consortium of NGOs has been funded for 2 or 3 years to deliver a particular type of support to a particular constituency, and then that's just suddenly cut off because that was what the program was. It was a 2-year or a 1 year or some sort of short-term program horizon. And then those people that were perhaps being given a chance to gradually improve their situation as a result of obtaining the social transfer are suddenly left with nothing, because the project winds up and everybody goes home, and that's the end of the story. So continuity is a very critical issue, and in relation to something like pensions, it comes to the fore, because once pensions are provided as a right, they represent a continuous form of social protection. To establish rights that are inviolable in law, and in particular pensions lend themselves to that possibility, because it's something that you have to legislate, and then you can't take it away from people very easily at all. And the final one there, to monitor outcomes, not just activities, and that's because social protection has tended only to monitor the success at delivering the product, whatever that is, and not what subsequently happened to the people that received those transfers in the longer term. 2 to go.
Okay.
Some broader conclusions. One of the broader conclusions is that, particularly with respect to problems around targeting, categorical targeting, where you choose a very well-defined category of the population to provide social transfers to, does have significant advantages over various types of rather complex poverty and vulnerability targeting. And you may want to come back on that in questions afterwards. Cash has many strengths, and there have been several journal articles and books, probably not only this one but others appearing, that that will champion cash above food as a means of providing transfers to very vulnerable people. But cash does have some serious weaknesses, and one of those serious weaknesses is how do you handle unforeseen big fluctuations in the price of the staple food that people rely on. Because with regular cash transfers, even in highly organized, rich and industrialized countries, it's very rare for routine cash transfers to be changed in level from one month to another, let alone from 1 year to another. It's a really big policy decision to change a regular monthly amount up to a new level. But if you depend on that regular monthly amount to buy your main staple food, and that's what you're spending it on, and the price of that staple food suddenly doubles from 1 month to another, perhaps for a seasonal reason or because of a world market reason, then suddenly that cash transfer is worth only a fraction of what it was before in terms of its coverage of food security. Electronic technologies offer potential for timely, secure and efficient delivery. This is using mobile phones, point-of-sale devices, mobile ATMs, other forms of electronic ways of getting money from a central point to the beneficiaries without the money going around in great big armoured trucks through remote rural areas where they can rather easily be ambushed and so on, not to mention other types of leakage which could easily occur. And finally, and this comes through very, very strongly from several of the case studies in Southern Africa, political support behind any kind of scaled-up social protection is essential if that scaled-up protection is actually going to be properly put in place, legislated, and supported by the government of the country concerned. And with 30 seconds left to go, just in brief summary, social protection and transfers as a response to chronic vulnerability is essentially the topic of the book. In other words, it falls within this slogan, predictable funding for predictable needs. There are three main areas of debate that kind of weave their way all the way through the book. One is the question of which is better, cash or food, from the point of view of providing transfers to very vulnerable and hungry people. Secondly, should transfers be conditional on the families receiving them doing certain things in order to receive the transfer, or should they be unconditional? And thirdly, should you go for categorical targeting where you have very easily defined categories of the population to provide transfers to, or poverty targeting, which is much more difficult to do. And the emerging consensus, sort of coming out of the book, but not by any means answering all the questions definitively, is in favour of cash, in favour of unconditional transfers, and perhaps leaning more towards categorical targeting rather than poverty targeting. And last phrase, but by no means resolved definitively. Thank you.
Okay.